What's up, guys? Welcome to our second video in our virtual seniors class. Last time we talked about who God is and who Jesus is, and this week I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about what this book is. As Christians, we believe a lot of things. We try to live in a certain kind of way, and pretty much all of that comes from this book, the Bible. And so, what is the Bible? What do we believe about the Bible? How do we think about the Bible in such a way that helps us to understand its effect on our lives as Christians? And so, there's just lots of questions about it. And so, I want to start by reminding us that the Bible is a work of literature. I think that's something that we forget a lot, and we think, well, like this was just this thing that God like beamed down to earth, and it just is gonna, it's just this religious text. But it's also a work of literature. That the Bible has not that much explanation in it, not that much like theological. Here are these ideas of what we believe, but that it's mostly stories and poems. It's even the theological parts of it, the letters in the New Testament, that those are written by specific people to specific churches in certain times and places. And so it really is a big compilation of literature. And I think that that's really cool, and that adds to how awesome and complex and beautiful Scripture is, because there's always more to learn, and there's always more to grow and to grasp in it. But that also makes it complicated, because stories are hard, can be hard to understand. Poetry can be hard to understand. It takes more work to get the payoff in those things. It's a lot easier just to have like a bullet pointed list of like, here's what I need to believe and here's what I need to do. But God gave us something much more awesome and much more beautiful than that. He gave us a story, a group of books, a group of works of literature that lead us to Him and to an understanding of Him, and to change hearts and lives and minds. So it is a work of literature. There are 66 books in my version, 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New. And they are written by different authors across a vast majority of time. And so they're written by human people. A lot of the books in the Old Testament are written by Moses or Solomon or other prophets in the time of Israel. A lot of the New Testament writers, the two biggest ones are Luke and Paul. Luke wrote Luke and Acts, which is the most content, and Paul wrote the most books because he wrote like, I don't know, 8 letters. I can't remember off the top of my head how many. Um, and and they're all different kinds and different peoples, and the people who wrote them, their personality comes through, their style comes through in the writing of it. What they believe and understand about the world comes through in the way that they write it. And so it's written from a specific, each book is written from a specific perspective. And so that's important for us to understand as we read Scripture. But above all of those, so we've got all these different authors and all these things, but above all of those, we believe that God inspired the Bible, which means that His Spirit was working in the writers to help them to say what God wanted them to say. That it was God's desire for these words to show up in these books in these ways with these messages. And that's not to say that like God, like the Spirit like took over their body and they like went out and then they just wrote this whole thing and woke up and were like, what happened? But it's to say that the Spirit was leading them to say what God wanted them to say, which is incredibly important for a couple of reasons. First is that God truly speaks to you and wants to be known by you. That God is not a distant God, that God is not far from us, but that He has chosen to speak to us so that we can know Him better and more clearly. And it also means that every word in this book is true. And I think that that's probably the most controversial claim that could be made about the Bible, that non-Christians would say, no, this is just a book written by men who don't know anything. There's a guy named Bill Maher, who's a non-Christian, and says, I can't believe that Christians would believe in these guys who are so old they didn't even know what a germ was, or something like that. That there are people who even Christians, some Christians believe that not everything in here is true, that a lot of it's true, or that like the main ideas are true, but that a lot of the details could be wrong. And I think that it's important for us, if we're going to take seriously the idea that God has written this book, that means that it is true and it is trustworthy, and that we need to wrestle with the ideas in it. Because there are difficult things, there are complicated things in here. One of the things people point out a lot is like apparent contradictions in Scripture. Like sometimes the Old Testament will have two accounts of a king, and this one will have like certain numbers, and this one the numbers will be different. It's like, well, how does that fit together? Or the timeline, like if you look at the timeline of the Gospels, some of the things don't seem to match up. And so the question is like, is that a contradiction? Is that an error? Or I think what I would say, and I think what Christians who are trying to understand the Bible as true would say, is that we don't fully understand what's going on there, or that it might seem like a contradiction, but it's actually just a different perspective on the events from a different point of view. But there's also stuff in the Bible that's not necessarily a contradiction, but it's just like hard to grasp or hard to understand. I think that for me, one of the hardest things in Scripture is dealing with God-sanctioned violence in the Old Testament. And it seems like God is telling the people of Israel to do the kind of violence that in other places he doesn't want anyone to do. And when we come to Jesus and we see Jesus is promoting peace and wanting to be a peacemaker and live by the sword, die by the sword kind of thing. And so it's hard for me personally to understand that. But I think it's important that we have to wrestle with it as true. So I listened to this podcast where they're talking about the nature of the Bible, and basically they're saying that the Bible is incarnational, is human and divine in the way that Jesus is human and divine. And so basically what they would say is like, if there's something like that in the Old Testament, like the violence in the Old Testament, that's just the human part of it, that's not the divine part of it. But I think that that's a misunderstanding of the Bible, and also a misunderstanding of what the incarnation is. That we talked last week about how Jesus is 100% God and 100% man. And so I think if we're going to say that the Bible is like that we have to say it's 100% God, which means it cannot include error. It cannot have things that are wrong in it. And so I actually think that it's a really helpful thing for us to wrestle with the difficulties of the Bible. Because if the Bible is just like a yes man who just agrees with everything that you think, then that's not actually going to help you. It's not actually going to push you to get closer to God or to grow closer to God. That we need something that is like God, that is outside of ourselves, that is pushing us to know him more and to be more like him and to deal with those difficult things in the Scripture. And so I don't have all of the answers for what all of those things are, but I have a fundamental conviction that the Bible is written by God and therefore is true in every single way. And that puts the weight on me to try to understand it. That I assume if I don't understand something in the Bible, not that it's a problem with the Bible, but it's a problem with my understanding. And so, we read the Bible and we try to understand it. And I think when you do that, it really will change you. I wrote my master's thesis on Scripture and what Scripture is, and the two biggest points that I had, it was all connected. So that if you look at a verse in Genesis and a verse in the prophets and a verse in Revelation, that those are connected through this overarching story of what God is trying to do. But the second is that the Bible should change you. You don't read the Bible just to get more knowledge, but that you read the Bible because it affects the way that you live in the world. That it changes your heart, it changes your mind, it helps you to love God and love Jesus more and to live more like him in his kingdom. And so that's why we love Scripture. And I've found that that as I have persevered through the difficulty of the Bible, through the questions that I have about the Bible, that it has been more and more open to me and unlocked to me and has changed the way that I think about God and changed the way that I think about the world. And it truly has changed my life. And so I think that this is an incredible book. I think that you can trust it. And I think that we should try to understand it more and more and more every day.